Well, hey, good morning again, everybody. It's good to be with you here on this Thursday morning. So hopefully I'll be back with you tomorrow. Still waiting to get my COVID results. Good news, my wife tested negative, so I'm assuming I will also, but can't come back till that's confirmed. But hey, thanks for hanging in there with me. I know that having to watch these lectures on your computer during class is kind of annoying. I appreciate that. I totally get that. But I appreciate you guys hanging in there with me this week through all this quarantine stuff. So we're just going to kind of pick up where we left off yesterday, continuing to talk about Jesus's resurrection. And so I want to go through some more of these slides here, and let's just kind of get right into it so we can make the most of our time. All right. So here we go. Okay. Sorry. All right, there we go. Forgive me, still getting used to all this. Okay. So we looked yesterday at the theological importance of Jesus's resurrection to the Christian faith. And so now I want to kind of look at this more from a historical perspective. Okay, so when we take the historical approach and we're looking back on this event and we're trying to see, is this true? Did this happen? That kind of stuff. We look at this through historical lenses. And so I just kind of quickly want to run through some of the method here and then get into more of the meat of what we're talking about. So with the historical approach, our interest should lie in determining a number of things. Number one, what facts concerning the fate of Jesus can credibly be established on the basis of evidence using the historical critical method. So basically research and evidence, all of that kind of stuff. Okay. And then after we gather the facts, what is the best explanation of those facts? So we're going to look at the biblical and extra biblical accounts, some cultural factors and things like that as we go through this. So what are the facts? Okay. We are establishing a historical fact. A couple of things need to be true. It needs to be recorded in very early sources, okay, close to the event having happened. It also needs to be recorded in multiple independent sources, right? So different people at different times at different places recording this event, but independent of one another. Also, the fact or event that we're trying to establish must lack legendary development. Now, what that means really quickly, legendary development is basically this idea that an idea or a belief develops gradually over time. Okay. Now, we'll get into this in just a minute, but many people think that the resurrection of Jesus is a myth or a legend. They think that this was something that just gradually developed throughout the early centuries of the church and came to be believed by later Christians. But when you look at the evidence, both biblical and just purely historical, you see that that is completely fallacious. That's just not true. The earliest followers of Jesus who knew him, they believed with all their hearts that Jesus rose from the dead, as did all the early Christians from the very, very beginning. Okay. Didn't develop over a long period of time. And when you're trying to establish a historical fact, there can't be other compelling or competing alternative theories to it. Okay. Things that could also be true. So, in other words, right, you have to have these different things here to help you establish an event in history. So there are at least 4 facts. There's more, but there are at least 4 concerning what happened to Jesus, which are widely accepted by New Testament historians today. Not just conservative scholars, not even just Christian scholars, okay, but the broad mainstream of New Testament scholarship throughout the world. Okay, now, to some of you, you may know this, to some of you, this may be a surprise. There are a lot of people who work in academia who are biblical scholars who are not Christians. They're not believers. Okay, they study the Bible more as just a set of historical documents. Okay, but even those scholars, New Testament scholars and historians, agree with at least these 4 facts. Okay, there's really no debate in both Christian and non-Christian, both conservative and liberal theological scholarship. There's really no debate about these 4 facts. Okay. Fact number 1, the crucifixion. Okay. Nobody argues the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was put to death by crucifixion on a Roman cross. Okay. Also, nobody argues the fact that after Jesus died, he was buried in a tomb. And historical sources, both biblical and non-biblical, tell us that the tomb belonged to a rich man who was part of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea. Okay. Now, the crucifixion and burial story, attested to in the Gospel of Mark, is the oldest known source material, okay, dating from around 42 to 47 AD. So within about 10 years of the events, okay, is when these were first written down by Mark. Now, the events, the tradition about those events is much older, but it was first written down within about 10 years of this happening. Okay. Now, a little bit later on, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which we read in class the other day, Paul also attested to Jesus's crucifixion and burial. Okay. Now, how do we know that Paul didn't simply just copy what Mark said? Okay. Well, if you look in the Greek in Paul in 1 Corinthians, there are Semitic or Hebrew expressions in the Greek words which were not original to Paul's authorship. Okay. So scholars believe that Paul received these words and what he said from tradition, from other Christians who had been Christians longer than him. Okay. Now, again, Jesus's crucifixion and burial, they lack any sign of legendary development. Okay, and there are no competing burial stories. There's no one out there claiming something else happened to the body of Jesus, right? And a quick note, this is obvious, but if you look also historically at the Romans, they did not invent crucifixion, but they perfected it. They were absolute experts at crucifixion and at death. They were medically trained on how to keep people alive for as long as possible, both in the torture that would precede crucifixion and then the crucifixion itself. So they knew what they were doing. Okay, so we know that Jesus died on the cross. Now, that seems very obvious, and it is, but we're going to see how there are people who actually try and deny that in their attempts to try and disprove his resurrection. And so we're going to look at that. Okay, fact number 2. Again, these are facts, historical facts, that are agreed upon by New Testament scholars the world over. Okay, again, those who are Christians and those who are not Christians. Okay, so fact number 2, the tomb that Jesus was buried in is empty. Okay, it was empty back then, it's still empty today. Okay, I haven't been there to Israel myself. I have many friends in churches around the country who have made trips to Israel, some several times. And historians know the site where Jesus was buried. There's no historical debate about that. And guess what? The tomb is still empty. He's not there. Okay. Now, the empty tomb of Jesus was also attested to by various sources. You have Mark, of course. You also have Matthew and Luke, who drew from Mark's gospel material when they wrote their gospels. You also have the Apostle Paul, of course. And then you also have the earliest oral traditions of the church, of Christians, from the very, very beginning. Okay. So there are various independent sources attesting to the resurrection of Jesus, to his empty tomb. Okay. Now, you also have, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in depth here in a few minutes, the response of the Jewish leaders. Okay, and you read about this especially in Matthew 28, 11 through 15. Okay, and remember, Matthew is one of Jesus's disciples. He was an eyewitness to all this. He was there. Okay, and the Jewish leaders, their response to the resurrection, to the empty tomb, was to concoct a story that the disciples went and stole the body. Okay, now I'll explain to you why that is completely irrational in a minute. But ultimately, here's the thing, and we talked about this yesterday when I read that quote from Dr. Gregory Boyd to you guys. Okay. The Jewish leaders, these people, all the skeptics, they never produced the body. Okay? They wanted Christianity to be untrue and they wanted to stamp it out. Okay? They did not want Christianity to flourish. All they had to do, the only thing they had to do was produce a body. That was it. And it was over. It would have been done right from the get-go. Never happened. Never produced the body. Okay. Now, when you read the Gospels as well, this third one, the first witnesses, okay, the very, very first witnesses to the resurrection were women. Okay, now to you and me, we're like, yeah, that's awesome, great. Okay, to ancient people, including ancient Greco-Roman and ancient Jewish culture, if you were going to lie and make up a story, you would not have had this be the case. Okay, so the people who wrote the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? They agree that the very first eyewitnesses to Jesus's resurrection were women. Okay, in this culture, okay, in ancient Jewish culture, a woman's testimony was not even valid in court, okay, because women were just seen as being inferior. Women were viewed primarily as property of their husbands and of their fathers. Women were seen as being inferior ontologically, okay, speaking of just their nature. Just by the virtue of the fact that they were women, they were seen as being inferior. The female gender, the female sex was seen as being inferior to men. Okay, now that's not something that the Bible teaches. That's not something that we as Christians believe, but that's what they believed. That was their cultural norm. Okay, so think about this. If you're one of Jesus's disciples and Jesus has died and he didn't rise from death, and you're like, oh no, right? And you want to perpetuate the myth. You want to create a religion where Jesus is the central figure, where he rose from the dead, right? And you're writing this account and you're telling people about this. You are not going to say that the first witnesses to his resurrection were women. That would damage your case, not help it. Okay. So in other words, in what possible motive would the disciples have had to include this detail if this wasn't true? If this didn't happen, you would not do this, right? Okay. Fact number 3, appearances of Jesus. Okay. So the first witnesses to Jesus's resurrection were women. Okay. Jesus appeared to his disciples 2 separate times, recorded in Scripture. Okay. The Gospel of John, you can read that in chapter 20 and chapter 21. At one point, Jesus appeared to over 500 eyewitnesses at one time. Okay. And then also he appeared physically to the Apostle Paul as well. All right. Okay. Now, this is attested to by multiple different sources: Peter, Paul, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all of that. Okay. This was also believed upon by the people that were their disciples, people like Ignatius of Polycarp, for example. Okay. Clement of Rome, an early bishop of the church in the 1st century. Okay. These guys who were trained and discipled by the original apostles themselves also wrote about these things and believed these things. Okay. Now, again, you might say, if you're skeptical, well, okay, fine, but the only written evidence we have of this is in the Bible, and they could have just made this all up. Like, yeah, okay, they could have made it all up. But number one, we talked about yesterday, these are all Jewish people. Okay, if Jesus hadn't risen from death, they're not going to worship him as God. Okay, because to them that would be blasphemy. Okay. Also, they're not going to make this up because this completely cut them off socially, politically, culturally from their people. They were pariahs. They were outcasts. Okay, these people gave up, in some cases, everything to follow Jesus. Okay, and when they wrote these things and they circulated these letters, right, this was very damaging to their reputations, to their livelihoods, and 11 of the 12 apostles, early history and tradition tells us, died violent deaths for their faith, for their testimony that Jesus had risen from death. Okay, and so the resurrection of Jesus is also the only explanation that really actually explains the boldness of the disciples and the emergence of Christianity from its very beginnings to go on and to grow into a faith that now stretches around the world. Okay. Right. So again, even if you could accept the ridiculous notion that all of these Jewish people, men and women, would worship Jesus as God and proclaim him to be Messiah if he had not risen from the dead and was just like any other person, even if you could swallow that, which, I mean, that's basically not even within the realm of possibility if you know your ancient culture. But even if you believe that, even if you believe that all these people knew that this was a lie, right? That this didn't happen, we made it up. Even if you believe that they all conspired together to invent this religion that is untrue, you cannot explain how they endured for decades and decades proclaiming Jesus as Messiah, okay? Being ostracized and persecuted by their fellow Jewish people, also by Gentiles around the Roman Empire, being persecuted by the empire itself from the very beginning. Like, nothing else explains this. It just logically, I mean, we're not even talking about faith here for a second, just logically, you can't explain this. It just makes no sense unless the events are true. Okay? And that brings us finally here, fact number 4, the transformation of the disciples. And we'll be done here in a few minutes. Okay? Again, the disciples, the 12, these are, again, devout Jewish men. Okay? They suddenly and dramatically came to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and they worshiped him as God. Okay? Now, if one random dude went around telling people that Jesus rose from death and that he was God, and everyone else was like, dude, you're crazy, right? Maybe we could be like, all right, that guy was just kind of out to lunch, right? But the fact that all 12 of them did, right? The fact that they all did without exception, and that they persevered in that belief all through their lives, how do you explain that? And not just the 12, but hundreds and thousands of early Christians who were Jewish, right? Strict Jewish monotheists came to believe that Jesus was God and Messiah and raised from the dead. This went against all of their expectations of what Messiah would be. Like I said yesterday, they thought he was going to come and overthrow Rome. Okay? It also went against their traditional Jewish upbringing in view of resurrection. Okay? If you look at the views of resurrection in the ancient world in the time of the New Testament, okay, the Greeks and Romans, the Gentiles, they believed that resurrection primarily had to do with the gods. Okay, so they believed, a lot of them, that their gods would die and rise from death each year with the harvest season, for example. Okay, so the gods of certain parts of the harvest. When the harvest was ripe, the god was alive, and then winter would come and everything would die, and they viewed their god as being dead, and their god would come back to life again the next year. That was their conception of resurrection, that the gods within their pantheon would die and rise again year after year. Okay? Very different from what the early Christians believed and what the resurrection of Jesus is. But it's also different from the Jewish conception. The Jews believed in a resurrection, but they all believed that it was a resurrection of all Jews. They didn't really have a concept that resurrection would happen to a single individual. Okay. And again, I'm not just making this up or pulling this out of my ear, right? This is historical academic scholarship from the intertestamental period of the New Testament, of the beliefs about resurrection of the Gentiles and the Jews. So Jesus's resurrection, it went against all of their expectations that they had. So again, if they were going to make all of this up, they would have probably tried to fit this into something that would have made sense to their fellow Jews and to the Greeks and Romans. But they didn't. They just reported this as they saw it. Okay, like I said, they spent the rest of their lives boldly proclaiming Jesus's resurrection, and they were willing to die brutally for their testimony. So again, even if you could swallow the idea that all 12 believed a shared lie and conspired together, again, which that's just beyond belief for me, but let's just say you believe that. Okay, even if you believe that, you're not going to tell me that all 12 of those guys are going to face persecution, some of them the loss of their families, the loss of their friends, their social status, their livelihood, going to spend their lives being chased and persecuted, and then decades later die a brutal, violent death for something that they knew they had made up and lied about. It's not going to happen. Okay? Early historical sources tell us that Peter was crucified upside down. All right. James, one of the Lord's brothers and one of the apostles, the leader of the early Jerusalem church, he, according to historical sources, was sawn in half, okay, which is a death that I don't even want to describe. So brutal, awful. Okay. Other disciples were crucified, right? And from the very beginning, Christianity and the hope of all of this was based upon the resurrection of Jesus. This did not develop over time. Okay. This is something that immediately, right away, the earliest Christians believed. Okay. This didn't develop over centuries and centuries into some myth that we Christians came to believe hundreds of years later. That's not what happened. Okay. So I know I'm taking a while here, but I just kind of want to get through all of this. So we're almost done. Hang with me. Thank you guys. You're awesome. I really appreciate it. Okay, so proposed explanation. And when you look at these historical facts, and again, these facts that are accepted widely by New Testament scholarship, both Christian and non-Christian, okay, at the highest levels of academia, right? What is the best explanation for all of this? Well, there have been 5 main theories that have been proposed and subsequently debunked throughout the years. The first theory is called the conspiracy or the displaced body theory, okay? This basically says that after Jesus died, he didn't really rise from death, but the disciples just took his body and they hid it, okay, to hide his body and to fake the resurrection accounts, right? Again, this is pretty silly on a number of fronts. Number one, I have a very hard time believing that the disciples could have hid Jesus's body and that nobody ever would have found out about it, right? And that they would have been able to fool hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people, even within the first couple of years of Christianity. Okay. Secondly, misplaced his body, like, oh, whoops, we forgot that we just put Jesus's body over there and we thought he rose from death. Come on, that's so dumb. Okay. The other problem with this is that Jesus's tomb was being guarded by Roman soldiers. Okay. Now, if you read the biblical accounts, there were up to 100 Roman soldiers possibly guarding the tomb of Jesus. Why? Well, they put Roman soldiers there to guard the tomb because they were afraid that the disciples might try and come and steal his body. Okay? They were afraid of that. And they might try and claim that he was resurrected. Okay? So you would also, if you were going to believe this theory, you'd have to believe that after Judas had died, 11 scared, frightened Jewish fishermen, tax collectors were able to sneak over to a very well-known public place and take down a huge group of professionally trained Roman soldiers who basically were trained to keep the peace, to kill, okay? You're gonna tell me that they overtook all of them, rolled away a massive stone, and then faked the whole thing? No, I don't think so. That just makes no sense. The second one is called the swoon or the apparent death theory. This one actually makes me laugh every time I hear about it. Okay, this one says that Jesus didn't actually die. He just kind of went into a coma. Okay. So to believe this theory, you would have to believe that Jesus had been scourged by the cat of nine tails, okay, beaten to within an inch of his life, nailed to a Roman cross, okay, passed out, didn't actually die, but passed out, had a spear shoved through his ribs into his heart, which then burst because water and blood came out, and medical doctors will tell you that that's basically a case of the water sac around the heart being punctured, okay? And then he was taken down, wrapped up, skin tight in burial cloths, placed in a tomb with a big stone rolled across it, which was guarded by a group of Roman soldiers. And then sometime later in the tomb, Jesus woke up from his coma unwrapped himself, which would, be amazing. In that condition he would have been in, with all the loss of blood and all of that, rolled away a stone by himself that probably weighed, at least 2,000 pounds, took out single-handedly all of these trained Roman soldiers and went around completely disfigured and torn to pieces, claiming, "Hey, I rose from death." Right? Like, really? Come on. That's so ridiculous. Okay. The other one, next one, 3, wrong tomb. This one's simple. The women, the disciples, Joseph of Arimathea, and all the early Christians just went to the wrong tomb. Need I say any more? That's pretty silly. Okay. Number 4, hallucinations. You guys saw this in the video that you watched the other day, that I had your sub show you, that all of Jesus's post-mortem appearances were just visions or hallucinations. Again, problem with this is that visions, dreams, and hallucinations are not shared by multiple people, okay, especially by large groups of people. Okay, right? So if Jesus's disciples were all eating mushrooms that made them hallucinate, and they all had like, "Whoa, Jesus has risen from the dead," you're not going to convince a bunch of devout monotheistic Jews to believe in Jesus if this is just a product of your imagination and hallucination. Like, no, I'm sorry, that wouldn't have happened. Hallucinations are not shared. And finally, the other main theory that's been proposed is the disciples lied. And again, like the first theory, this one just says the disciples knowingly fabricated all of this and spent the rest of their lives being persecuted, being ridiculed, losing everything they cared about, and ultimately dying brutal, violent deaths for something they all knew was a lie. And not one of them for their whole lives ever caved in and admitted that they were lying. And they managed to deceive tens of thousands of people, even within their own lifetimes, and keep this thing going. None of these things are plausible. These explanations don't work. Okay? The best explanation, whether you're a Christian or not, okay, now you guys know me, I'm a Bible teacher, I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus, I believe that he's God, and I believe that he rose from the dead with all my heart. That's my faith commitment, my conviction, and I will believe that till the day I die. Okay, so you know where I stand, right? But even if you're not a Christian, right, what other logical, rational conclusion could you come to given these historical facts, these indisputed facts? Okay, these are facts you have to deal with. The only logical, rational conclusion you can reach is that what the scriptures say is actually true, that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead physically, as the scriptures tell us. Okay? This is the only thing that adequately explains everything that has happened historically in the lives of the disciples and in the enduring testimony and legacy of the Christian church throughout the last 2,000 years, which arose under very hostile circumstances. Okay? So as the Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians, Jesus truly is risen. Okay? So I hope this has helped make some sense out of all of this. And again, when we're doing apologetics and all of that, my goal here is not to try and intellectually persuade you to, believe in Jesus. I don't think that I'm even capable of doing that. That's not my goal. I'm just presenting before you the facts and the evidence here. And yeah, I'm totally preaching the gospel for sure. That's what I believe, and that's what I do as a Bible teacher and as a pastor. But to me, I mean, this makes sense. So I hope this has been helpful for you guys. Thank you for watching this very long lecture. I appreciate your attention. And if I am back tomorrow, I promise you I won't do a big long lecture. We'll do something else. So anyway, I do miss seeing you guys. I appreciate having you in class. I enjoy interacting with all of your work in the gospel reflections and your notes and all of that. It's great. I love reading your comments and interacting with you guys. So I appreciate you. Thank you. Keep doing well. We're almost done with week 5. So you guys are doing great. Keep it up. And assuming I have a negative COVID test, I will hopefully see you guys tomorrow. But whether I do or not, I hope you stay healthy. Have a great rest of your Thursday. And I will see you very soon. Peace.